Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world.
Welcome back to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Managing Editor Mariah Richard, here with Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones, Senior Editor Robert Lee Brewer, and Editor Michael Woodson. This week, I'm super excited to say that we're going to be tackling the concept of world building. Later in this episode, I'll chat with urban fantasy author Whitney Hill about creating fantastical settings in fiction, and Robert has a great conversation with poet Janine Hall Gailey about world building in poetry. But before that, I want to pick my fellow editors' brains about this idea. Hey, everyone!
Hey.
To kick us off, does anyone want to define world building for us in their own words?
Yeah, I can go first. I have a very non-technical definition. I was thinking it's more, I think the first thing I think of is setting, but I have learned through your world building articles in the magazine, Mariah, that it is so much more than that. It's about creating the society and the norms that sort of contain the book. And I guess it's also anything that makes the readers feel like they are in the book, experiencing what the characters are experiencing. That's sort of how I've started thinking about it lately.
Yeah, and I totally, like, that's kind of how I feel about world building as well. It's kind of the feeling you get when you're in the story. And I agree with Amy. I originally always thought of it as setting when I first started writing fiction, that, you know, world building's just setting and describing stuff, but really it's the people, the culture, the media, the things that people are worried about, and all of that type of stuff.
Yeah, same. I think it's one of those things where it starts, for me, was with setting and then atmosphere, and then it sort of focused in on what populates that setting and atmosphere, and how sort of in a symbiotic way, whatever species of person inhabits that atmosphere helps with the world building as well.
And I think something that's really interesting about world building is that generally when we think about it from a literary perspective, we do think about it in terms of fiction, right? Mm-hmm. So we think fantasy, sci-fi, genres that really create a brand new world that readers have to be familiarized with. But when I was editing self-help books back in the day, I came to learn that world building is really just how you tell a story in a way that immerses your audience totally within the story. So I could be, talking about the time that I went down to the coffee shop and I ran into an ex-professor. But in telling that story, I'm building the world of the coffee shop. I'm showing you my perspective, which, we could all go to the same place together and have wildly different experiences with it. So in point of view, in plot, in setting, all of these things are working in tandem to build the world of your story. And I think that's what really excites me about this topic. So my next question is like...
Can I jump in real quick?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. What you said about the coffee shop made me think about another misconception I had about world building before I, really started working for Writer's Digest and getting to know the concept of world building as a literary concept. I took it very literally, world building, and associated it a lot in my head with building an entire world, as opposed to deciding how to choose the part of, I guess I thought of Star Wars to some degree. There are so many worlds that they built a universe, but they had to build all of those those actual worlds, the planets that they're on. And so I thought of the world in world building as a planet, a full world. And really it is, you have to choose how to contain it somehow, whether it is, a community where there is a coffee shop and that is one piece of it, or are you really going to go huge and think about an actual, you know, invented universe or planet for your characters?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I used to think about it that way as well. But, the more that I've gotten into, uh, really analyzing, like that's kind of the fun thing about our job is we get to really sit back and analyze
Mm-hmm.
things all the time. Uh, but like, there's world building where you create an entire planet, but then there's world building like London and the
Mm-hmm.
fog, with detectives running around or uh, depraved murderers or or whatever it is, and like that London is a world in itself, and uh, there's so many different ways you can spin it, and that's still fiction. But then that's the same thing with nonfiction. There's like the world where you're worried about people's health, and there's the world where it's just you're just there to have a really good time and do really fun stuff. So it is, yeah.
And something else that I think is really interesting, like when you were talking about like the container of world building. I was recently at a conference where I sat in on a panel about the monstrous in publishing. So when I went into that panel, I was like, "Ooh, monsters, fiction!" But in it, they talked about how to tackle monstrous things in memoir. So at the end of the day, as a fiction writer, the elements that you're employing to discuss like a fictional creature monster is some of the same aspects of world building as the memoirist is using to discuss trauma. And that connection really astonished me because I never really thought about when I think about fiction and I think about the way that particularly horror uh, deals with larger topics is a lot of times the monster can be metaphor, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
stand-in for something else. Not always, but a lot of times it is. And so it never really occurred to me that when you're tackling that, so for example, say you're tackling like the fear of being known, right, or being seen. You can do that through things like haunted mirrors in fiction. But if you're tackling that same theme, the fear of being known or seen, in something like creative nonfiction or memoir, like you're employing that same theme using some of the same techniques, but you're stripping a lot of the metaphor out of it. But there's still two monstrous things. So it was just a really interesting way that I think is going to change the way that I read, if that makes sense. Because I think that like the more we become aware of these things as editors and writers, the more we approach reading in like a slightly skewed angle. So I'm really excited to see like the next time I pick up a memoir, am I going to experience it the same way, keeping those things in the back of my mind.
Yeah, definitely, and that's like a cool point in itself. We won't get all the way down into it, but just how learning and thinking about these different elements of writing end up impacting you the rest of your life when you're reading
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Totally.
Um, and I guess that does bring me to my next question. Like, as a reader, how do you determine if a writer has done world building well?
For me, the reading the book, um, it's almost like I stop seeing the words, and it sort of becomes a movie in my head to the point where I don't know that I have actively flipped the page. I just know that somehow I'm 30 pages further along than I was when I started, because I have gotten so into the world that this writer has created, that because I can identify immediately the point at which I'm taken out of it, and it'll be something that just seems slightly out of place. You know, a word or a phrase or something, a piece of dialogue that is that doesn't seem quite natural. That will immediately suck me out of my movie playing in my head, and that's when I start seeing the words on the page again. But until that point, the world is so real, and I feel so into it, that I don't see the words anymore. I don't think I would make a very good editor of fiction because I'm not sure that that would actually be constructive feedback for any kind of writer.
I think for me, whether world building is done like quote unquote well depends on what kind of reader you are. So for me, I don't need my world building to be what's known as hard world building. Like, I don't need to know the science down to a T of your world to be immersed in it. So say I'm reading something that's like very like technical sci-fi. I don't need the science to be explained to me as long as like Vulcan nerve pinch, sure. I don't need to know how that works. I just need to know that it does work. Um, and so I know though for a lot of readers, like especially I'm married to a huge Lord of the Rings fan, to the point where like I cannot ask a question during watching one of the films without like it needs to be we need to pause it and then we're going to get like an entire history lesson that's going to take an hour because the way that he reads is he needs to know the answers to every question he could possibly have, or else he doesn't really enjoy the book, which is why he doesn't read a lot of fiction, where I'm not like that at all. So it really depends on like what kind of story your reader is looking for and if you've done enough of the technical basis to satisfy them. So for me, I don't need to have all the questions answered. I'm more like you, Amy, where if you've really like captured my attention with your story and I'm fully immersed in it and I'm, there with your characters, that's all I need.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that too, and I think part of it is I think it's any given story. I don't really have like a feeling of this is what I think is the best version of world building. It's like if this book do it successfully how it wanted to do it. And but for me, like what I find I prefer is just a certain level of restraint because I think a lot of times with world building, less is so much more, and it offers a lot of confidence from the writer, and it trusts me to sort of like go along with it and be okay with being confused for a little while. Because a lot of my favorite world building comes from magical realism, and a lot of magical realism at face value is our reality, but there's something different about it that makes it so specific, and restraint plays a big part of that. So I think for me, it's a lot of what's not on the page and what's assumed, and that what I can bring to it as the reader of it.
Yeah, I think for me that's something that helps with world building is I when I'm reading it, I feel like the author like really knows the world and the stuff
Right.
that's off screen, and that the characters are um, doing their thing in this world that makes sense. I think when it's not done as well, um, it feels like things are kind of being made up as they go along. Where
That's a good point.
like I can go into something, have no idea how like different things work, but like the world building's done well if it feels like everyone else has like some kind of common understanding of what's going on and the history and the politics and stuff. And eventually I'll start to learn all this stuff if I continue to follow them. But yeah, for me, that's kind of how it works.
It feels like a common thread among what each of us is saying is that like the writer has the skill to do all of these different things, but they're not necessarily like flaunting it in the writing. They're not like showing off their ability to, create this world system or, write beautiful dialogue or construct a wonderful sentence. It's that they do all of those things so well that even we as editors don't even notice it. And it's just the story has captivated us in some way.
Going off of what I've been hearing from you guys, and this just sparked in my mind. So I think for me, a lot of like successful world building is also done through personality. So I want to hesitate on saying like characters, because I think you can have like a really like punchy kind of voice. Like I think about Terry Pratchett, whose like narrators are like can be very engaging outside of the characters themselves. But I'm thinking about specifically The Martian by Andy Weir, which is I tend more towards like horror, fantasy, like dark fiction, less towards sci-fi. But that was a sci-fi novel that I really enjoyed, specifically because all of the science was delivered through, I believe the character's name was Mark, right? But he was like so funny, and the novel was laid out in a way that it made sense that he, an expert, is explaining all of these things to us, the layperson. And he did it in a way that didn't feel like I was sitting there reading a textbook. So I think that when you are world building a completely new world, the way that you can make that familiar to your readers through character or through personality of the narrator. And just making sure that like when you do have to explain things to make sense for your readership, that you're doing it from that personality, rather than just like, and here's some information that you need to know.
Right.
That's such a good point. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but that makes so much sense. Having a purposeful vehicle for giving this information to the reader can really make all of the difference.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes, like, I think something that maybe people don't think about as much with world building is thinking about tone. And I think maybe that's the same, like, it's just a different way of saying personality, as that thinking about like tone of a world makes a difference, whether there's a big difference between, you could have two different stories like at the same, we'll say, coffee shop as the example, but this table over here is a rom-com while this one over here is like a murder mystery, and they're tossing back theories or whatever. So you can both be like in the same exact place at the same exact time, but like the tone is different for these like two different worlds.
So thinking about, as a reader or an editor, what book or books really surprised you or impressed you with their world building?
I brought a couple of examples. The first one, I will say, this episode comes out in May, and our May-June issue of the magazine, which I got at my house today, is an interview with Kate Quinn. And I knew her from, my introduction to her was reading The Alice Network, which was the Reese Witherspoon book that lots of people read about World War I. I did not realize that until I was preparing to interview her, that she had written a quartet of books about ancient Rome, which is not a time period that I know a lot about. But through those four books, I got such an interesting, very vibrant image of that time and place in my mind. And it was because, they were traveling throughout the city and there were these recognizable places that still exist, but they were being used in their original purpose, like the Colosseum. It was very bloody in that place. And while now it's a lovely tourist attraction, she showed that world in a very different way. And through the four books, it was I saw a different piece of it every time, which was I don't know, a delightful change of pace from the other historical fiction that I read, which coincidentally also takes place in Europe, just at a different time period. The other one that I wanted to mention was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And I mentioned earlier the idea of containing the world. And, my initial impression of world building was that of a full actual planet style world. But A Gentleman in Moscow takes place entirely in one hotel. The entire book, this entire man's life, he is his entire adult life, essentially. He is in this hotel and he cannot leave. And the book is very contained in that way. And you really get to know the inner workings of this hotel. And in my mind now, I can see where the flower shop is in the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. And I have an idea of what the kitchen looks like and where the Count's room is up in the attic and how he discovered another doorway that went into another room. But the way that came to life in my mind was seeing it through the perspective of this man who is forced to live there. And if he leaves, he will be captured by the Soviet. Not the KGB at the time, but the precursor to the KGB. So you get to see and appreciate the dark corners of the hotel, and it has become this man's entire world, and how he can have a full life within the constraints of this one building. And I just thought that was it was incredible. It was a beautiful book.
I think for me, there are so many great examples of world building that I kind of wanted to start with the one that kind of launched world building in my head as like a concept, and that was Anne Rice and her Vampire Chronicles. And she also wrote a series of books about the Mayfair witches, and I believe even like her one off The Mummy. They were all like kind of in the same world that happens to be in our world, but it's like this secret world going on without us realizing it, with vampires, witches, mummies, all completely believable. A secret society that studies all of these phenomena as well, that's made up of like actual like humans, just normal people. And she makes it like, Anne Rice makes it like so believable. For my concept of what New Orleans was as a teenager, it was all created by Anne Rice. And the same thing with San Francisco. Like, it's Anne Rice's San Francisco, Anne Rice's New Orleans, Anne Rice's Europe to a certain extent. So for me, like, that was like kind of like the thing, the big world building that really like launched it for me. And what got me to read it was listening to my brother and my mother talk about this world, because they were reading it first, and listening to them, I was like, whoa, I need to like get some of this, whatever you guys are on, and talking about. So that's kind of like where it all started for me. And then I was also thinking about a nonfiction example. Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City for me is like a really good example of world building from a nonfiction perspective and the way that he creates Chicago at the turn of the century for the World's Fair, and just like you feel like you're there and like you're in the city, you're on the fairgrounds, and going through that you know what how it actually transpired, which is great world building as well.
Yeah, I think period stuff like what Eric Larson does can do really good world building. I read Thunderstruck by him, and same thing, and it almost felt like a fever dream reading it, because I know I haven't experienced this, and it's living in this dark space in my brain as if I have been there. And in that time period was just like unlike anything I'd ever read in nonfiction. Not one of my picks, but I wanted to say that. My first pick
Sure.
book I'm bringing to the chat is called Poppy Show by Leone Ross. It's also, gorgeous cover.
It is a gorgeous cover.
Look at that. It's magical realism and is inspired by her Jamaican homeland, the authors. So a lot of it is tangible and realistic, but then it's an impossible book to describe. So just listeners and fellow editors, please just look up the description. Just incorporated into the atmosphere is just a lot of fantasy adjacent stuff that like magical realism often plays with, but at no point is anything articulated or described, taken any moment to say this is what this means and this is this. It just says these things. It never quite defines that this kind of person is a god and this person has this special skill. It just trusted me to eventually understand that, and it just made me feel like I was actively realizing I was becoming a better reader in reading it, because the world building was just unlike anything I'd ever read before. And another one is kind of out there, but in the Unlikely Event by Judy Blume, it came out like in 2014 or 2015, and I think it's the last book she wrote as of late, and it's only her second book for adults. And it takes place in the 1950s in New Jersey, where 3 separate planes come crashing into this small town. And so like the world around that is very important, and that it takes place in this tiny town is so much a part of the story. And it felt so real to me. And the whole time I was reading it, I was like, I'm loving this. This is extraordinary. The hardest part was like, there's no way 3 planes could crash into this tiny town in the same year. That's bananas. And then in the acknowledgments at the end, it says that this actually happened to Judy Blume in her lifetime in this small town. So I was like, okay, so my only criticism for it is not real. Like this, okay, fine, school me. But I just, because it's very realistic fiction, and the world technically is very realistic, but I was there the whole time. And her writing style really helps with that, because she's very, she's not very flowery in her language. She just writes things as they are, and it made it feel, I think, that much more realistic.
When you were speaking, it like jogged a memory of like it made me feel something about a book that I read a long time ago that was like not on my list, but is on my bookshelf there. So I turned to check the title, and it's The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness.
I love Patrick Ness.
And I'm not sure if you guys have read that book, but the basic premise is that it's set in a high school where there is like the chosen one, and she has her story going, but the book is not about her. It's about the others, like a group of friends who are just going to this high school when like all of this stuff is going on around them. And the world building was interesting to me specifically because it came from a very different angle, right? Like they don't have anything to do with her journey, like the hero's journey, until the very end. But they are having journeys of their own because like every teenager is the hero of their own growing up,
Yeah.
right? So that was something that I don't even remember what you said, Michael, that I was like, wait a minute. Reminded me of reading that. But on my list, I do have literally anything written by Victor Laval, who I believe is like a master of world building. But specifically, if I have to name one book, I'm going to say The Changeling, just because like I can read that book a million times and still find new pieces of the world that are like it unearths itself slowly, I feel, is also just extremely beautiful and emotional. And then recently, I've read The Witch King by H.E. Edgman, which is, I want to call it magical realism because the novel starts in our world and then travels into, like very quickly, travels into a Fey realm, and then we're in the Fey realm for the rest of the book. So I can see an argument for people saying that it's more of like a high fantasy, because the Fey realm it's like an adjacent realm to our world, but it's not Earth. But they have things like a big plot point has to do with a bewitched telephone because the Fae are trying to update, right? So they're like, oh, humans use telephones. We can like make our own telephone and like have it do magic stuff, which I just think is like super cool.
Genius.
And so that one actually has a second book coming out this year, in case you're interested. But then something else I've recently read is Leigh Bardugo's Ninth House,
Oh,
which if you know me as a person, like I will start a book, I will read like 3 chapters, and then I will stop reading it for like 8 months, and then I'll pick it up and I'll finish the rest of it in one day. So that was kind of my experience with Ninth House, where I was like, oh man, I'm really enjoying this book, and then like put it down and was just like, I'll get back to you. But I finally did very recently, and oh my God, like blew me away. I really enjoy her young adult writing, but I just think that her writing for adults is like just perfection.
I think that has a sequel coming out too.
Yes, and they just released the cover design for it, which it's very like a spooky cover, but if you've read Ninth House, like just because of the cover, I'm like so excited for the plot of this second book because like I know that the cover has like a lot of meaning. But I'm not gonna spoil it here for you. You'll just have to read it. But yeah, they just announced the sequel to that one as well. So I think that's where I'm gonna cut myself off because like literally, if it's on my bookshelf, I've enjoyed the world building. So we'll just press pause on that. But before we end our chat, I did want to ask: does anybody have any final advice for writers who are building their worlds?
This is gonna sound like duh, but I guess I'd say like if your intention is to do a specific type of world building, first like write everything you know about it, and then learn what to take out. And because I think for me, just like the best world building is what is off the page, and the confidence in the author to know what to take off the page. So I think, yeah, and just do it confidently. Like chances are nobody's read the world that you're creating, so that's already pretty cool.
It's funny, I think my advice is almost the exact opposite, and it might be because of the type of people we are.
Yeah, perfect.
The idea, my advice was to don't let the idea of world building overwhelm you, and to maybe take it a piece at a time, because that's what gets to me is when I think about, oh, I've got to create this entire thing, I get overwhelmed by it. I mean, I think if I were to like break it down, think about a piece of it, like a specific location or, and then build from it, then it might not seem so daunting.
Yeah, and I'm going to tie both of those together because I just recently went through an experience with Mariah's Flash Fiction Challenge that helped me finally get this world that I've been building in my head and on paper since like 2016, but I just did not have the stories. Like I knew that I had stories that needed to be told about this specific world, and I'd been building it and building it and building it, but I just couldn't quite get into any of the specific stories, even though I knew different things that happened in this place. But then with Mariah's Flash Fiction Challenge, I was like, okay, like here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take her prompt each day, and I have to keep it at 1,500 words or less and tell a story. And then the next day, do the next thing, and then do the next thing. And then that helped me like kind of through that process of keeping stuff short, helped me like kind of unlock the world and start telling the story, which has been really exciting since. Like I've kind of kept up that habit of just writing a little bit each day around like a certain prompt. And I agree with both of those. Is like, like definitely like build this big world, but then like don't get overwhelmed by it. Like start just telling stories, because after you've written it all, you can go back through and start to kind of iron stuff out, I guess. Like there are things that like when the beginning of February, uh, the story at the end of February, like it started to take shape like halfway through the month. So like by the end of the month, like I knew what the story was at the beginning. Like I was just like, okay, I'm just starting off. I think the first prompt was like something to do with a key. So I was like, I'm just gonna have somebody locked out of their house. We're gonna go from there. and uh, and then I figured it out as I went along, and can go back through and tighten stuff up elsewhere.
Keeping things short helped me unlock the world. It was beautifully said, Robert, and was like an aha moment for me as a
Yeah, I
writer.
mean, it's only taken me 40 something years to figure this out. So, and who
Yeah,
knows what else I
yeah.
don't know.
It was funny for me to answer this question because I do write the Building Better Worlds column for the magazine, so it's like all my advice is in the column. Go read it. No, but for me, honestly, at the very core of it, being straightforward and consistent will always serve your story better than trying to be clever. I think at the end of the day, we try to be different or sparkly, but really, you're the only one who can tell your story. So as long as you just focus on telling the story, everything else is going to fall into place eventually.
Love it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for this great chat, and stick around because we're going to be talking to authors Whitney Hill and Janine Hall Gailey.